Welcome to Shad's Guitar Show. Whether it's the gear or the players who made the gear famous, this podcast is about all things guitar. Well, hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome into Shad's Guitar Show. I'm your host, Shad Worrell, as always, and glad you're joining me today. I was just thinking about how this year, 2025, is almost over. And, here we are at the end of November, early December. I'm not sure exactly when this episode will come out, but what a chaotic time in the world, right? I mean, especially in here in the U.S., I mean, just so much going on. And it makes me so glad to have such an amazing escape from all of this that is music and playing guitar and just being able to disconnect from all the chaos and just create. And speaking of creating, I have just really been enjoying creating this podcast and watching it grow. You know, when you start something out, you never know what's going to happen. The world is such a crowded place in so many ways. There's so many podcasts and so many people trying to do things that are interesting. And I hope that you guys find this interesting. I've really enjoyed doing it, and I'm watching a lot more people get involved. I'm seeing a lot more downloads. People seem to be, catching on to the show, and getting people interested and, on board takes time. And so I'm glad to see that it seems to be going in the right direction. And for you guys who've shared the podcast with friends or promoted it in any way, I am so grateful to you, and thank you very much. All right, so without further ado, let's get into the topic of the day, which is going to be a little discussion on the Gibson Explorer. We're going to go back in time a little bit, talk about its history, when it came out, kind of the philosophy behind it, why it even exists, and, as we go, we'll talk about maybe some of the key players that are famous for using the Explorer, and just kind of get a little understanding of this guitar model. And hopefully you'll learn something, and maybe you'll even decide you want to check out an Explorer if you haven't already done that. Okay, so although the Explorer officially went into production in 1958, we do need to go back 1 year further to 1957. And that is when the Explorer, along with the Flying V and the Moderne, were shown at the 1957 NAMM show. And if you're not familiar with what the NAMM show is, it's a convention, and NAMM stands for National Association of Music Merchants. Basically, it's a convention where, all of the companies who build musical instruments would get together and showcase at this convention all the new products they were coming out with for the new year. Gibson being no exception. They were showing these guitars, and by all accounts, a lot of the companies that they would deal with, the dealers, were not all that thrilled about these designs. They didn't really get it. They seemed way too far out there. And my guess is that a lot of these dealers didn't place orders because they didn't really think that these would be great selling guitars. But at this point, Gibson was kind of feeling the heat. Leo Fender had designed the Telecaster and then the Stratocaster, and he was really kind of dominating the scene with new, younger guitar players who really liked these modern, sleek designs that Fender was coming out with. And Gibson was obviously known as more of an artisan type company. They built ornate, beautiful, handcrafted guitars. And they were, a lot more expensive than the Fender stuff. And they needed something, to kind of be radical enough to get people to look back over at Gibson and away from Fender. So Ted McCarty, who was the president of Gibson at that time, really decided to gamble on what he thought the future might look like for guitars. And he was working with a designer named Ray Dietrich. Now, Ray Dietrich came from the automotive industry and had worked with Lincoln and Chrysler to design some really futuristic looking cars. And we all know, the big tail fins and everything of the 50s era automobiles. So he was trying to bring some of that design aesthetic into the guitar world. And the two conceived this trio of futuristic models, the Flying V, the Moderne, and the Explorer, which we're talking about today. And these three guitars made up what Gibson was calling the modernistic line. So Gibson chose to make these new guitars out of a wood they called Carina. And Carina is an industry name for limba, which is available in both black and white variants. The difference is kind of interesting because both types are generally found within the same tree. Limba often develops gray streaking through the grain towards the bottom of the tree, which tends not to continue to the top. Black limba is the stuff with the streaks and is logged from the bottom of the tree, while white limba, which is what they were making these guitars out of, on the other hand, is logged from the upper reaches of the tree and has really no strong streaking. And this is one area where I would say Gibson definitely differs from Fender, maybe still to this day, but especially then, was Gibson was making aesthetic choices as to how these guitars would look. Where out on the West Coast, Leo Fender was more about what could he get that was inexpensive and did the job well. It's kind of, there's a duality here where Gibson was looking at things from an aesthetic eye. You know, they wanted beautiful things, where Leo was looking at the guitar more from a utilitarian standpoint of like, okay, so Leo wasn't choosing, you know, ash or alder or whatever for his guitars based on the way that it looked, but really more so the cost of the wood and the availability. So Carina was used for the bodies of all these future forward designs and finished with a natural clear coat, since Carina has a pleasant, understated look. It also has a very similar tonal profile to mahogany, and we all know how important mahogany is to the sound of a Gibson guitar. Carina is also less dense generally, while retaining a high level of strength. So it's a perfect choice for a bigger bodied guitar like Flying V's or Explorers. Keep the tone, lose the weight. The fact that the white limba is a visually attractive timbre only helped seal the deal. So the Explorer featured a set neck, two PAF humbuckers, and the now legendary hockey stick style headstock design. Despite its radical looks, the guitar actually played like a classic Gibson. It was warm, powerful, and full of that classic Gibson sustain. But despite the high hopes that Ted McCarty may have had for these new guitars, the Explorer, like the V and the Moderne, were absolute commercial bombs. And by 1960, Gibson stopped production. So the original run of 58 and 59 Explorers was incredibly small. Fewer than 50 units are believed to have been made. They were simply too weird for the times, and as we talked about, most dealers didn't want to stock them, and players were sticking with more traditional and familiar shapes. The original 58 Carina Explorer is one of the most valuable guitars in existence, ranked number 4 in Vintage Guitar Magazine's listing for the most expensive guitars on the planet. So getting your hands on an authentic 50s example is not only highly unlikely, but would be horrendously expensive. But that's definitely not to say they aren't out there, and there's a few famous examples. The actor Jason Momoa actually owns one that's called Big Ed, and it was originally owned by Kirk Hammett. It is with Gibson on display, but he is the owner, and it is a real 58. Slash owns a 1958 Gibson Explorer with a Bigsby on it. Rick Nielsen from Cheap Trick has a real 58 Carina Explorer. And interesting is Eric Clapton actually played a 58 Explorer back in the Yardbird days, which was modified with the top point was cut off at an angle. And you can see pictures of that if you search Clapton Explorer. Kind of interesting. And I'm not totally sure if James Hetfield from Metallica has a real 58 Carina Explorer, but I know he and Kirk Hammett both have real 58 Vs. And because, James is such a fan of the Explorer shape, as we'll talk about here in a bit, it wouldn't surprise me if he had one also. He certainly has the money to acquire one, no doubt about that. And if you want to experience some of that late 50s Carina Explorer mojo, but you don't have Metallica money to buy one, you can get one from the Gibson Custom Shop. Still pricey, but way less money than you'd ever pay for a real 50s example. And If budget constraints are a real thing, Epiphone also makes a really cool 58 Carina model. And if you're on a tight budget, you could even grab Epiphone's version of the 58 Carina Explorer. And kind of as an aside, an interesting connection between sort of the failure of the Explorer and V in the late 50s to connect with the intended audiences. Fender sort of had their first failure with the Jazzmaster in the exact same time frame. That had more to do, I think, with just missing with the intended jazz guitar audience. But interesting that both companies had designs that they thought were going to be wildly successful that absolutely were not at the time. But as is often the case, things catch on later as time evolves, and players started rediscovering the Explorer. And in the late 60s and 70s, the futuristic shape suddenly looked right at home. Gibson actually reissued it in 1976 as the limited edition Explorer, and this time it was way more popular. And the 1976 reissue Explorer is a guitar that was made famous by the Edge from U2. He acquired his on a family vacation to New York, and that was the guitar that he used as U2 became a band. And on the first few albums, that's pretty much the only guitar he used. And another player that comes to mind from the alternative world that is well known for using an Explorer is Dave Koenig from The Killers. Every picture you see of him playing is typically with that 76 Explorer that he has. But even as cool as the 1976 reissue Explorer might be in the hands of the Edge, it just is nowhere near as cool or valuable as the 58 Carina version of the Explorer. So as time goes on, the Explorer becomes really popular, at least the shape of the Explorer becomes really popular in the hard rock and heavy metal world. So we see a lot of companies that are catering to those kinds of players adopt this basic design. Companies like Hamer did a version that you can see Rick Nielsen playing often, as he was a Hamer endorser. Jackson made some similar designs, as did Ibanez in the Lawsuit era. And Dean Guitars made a lot of guitars in this style and shape for Dimebag Darrell, which were their Razor guitars. Slight modifications and differences, but the basic aesthetic of the Explorer is definitely there. But no company has made better use of this design than ESP guitars, and even in their LTD, more budget-friendly import line. And that has a lot to do with their working with James Hetfield from Metallica, as we spoke about before, and his famous Snakebite ESP guitar. And there's definitely been some signature model Explorers over the decades. As long as we're talking about James Hetfield, he had a Gibson Custom Shop Rusty Iron Explorer that would later be the prototype for his ESP models. The Edge, which we talked about as well, had a signature Explorer based on his 76. Matthias from the Scorpions, so they built him an Explorer that had a slightly sleeker body, shorter headstock, and a tremolo system, and it was designed for more high output rock tones and playability. An early Super Explorer, I guess you could say. And an interesting hybrid that they built for Lizzie Hale from Hailstorm. She has an Explorer and a Firebird combined guitar, kind of a modern stylish take. It had gold hardware, a white finish, and really hot humbuckers, and it was sort of part of Gibson's push to modernize the Explorer shape for a new generation. Oh, and one player that I can't believe I almost forgot to mention is Alan Collins from Lynyrd Skynyrd. He actually had a 58 Carina that he used in the band, and you can hear it extensively on the song Freebird. All right, so in closing, I guess we could say that the Gibson Explorer is one of those examples of a guitar that was just too far ahead of its time when it first came out. But that design has certainly caught on with a lot of players, and it has become way more popular across a lot of different genres. And personally, having owned several Explorers over the years, I would definitely say that if you haven't tried one, it's a guitar that you should check out. And that's going to do it for this episode of Shad's Guitar Show and this short look at the Gibson Explorer. And I hope that it has given you some information about this guitar that maybe you didn't know before. And I hope you found the episode interesting. And if you guys have some favorite Explorer players or people that I didn't mention, definitely put that in the comments. Or, if you just want to let me know about maybe your experience with the Gibson Explorer or some Explorer variant, that would be awesome. I'd love to hear your stories. And I look forward to talking to you guys next time. And always remember, the best guitarist is the one who's having the most fun.